I, 42M, never thought I'd be writing this, but recent events have forced me to share what happened. My ex-wife, 39F, and I divorced 6 years ago, and we have a son, 14M, together. The split was relatively amicable. We just grew apart, and both agreed it was better to end things before we started hating each other. We managed to maintain a decent co-parenting relationship, with our son spending alternate weeks with each of us. Despite the divorce, we made sure to attend his school events together, coordinated on his extracurricular activities, and generally tried to keep things as normal as possible for him. 3 years after our divorce, my ex met someone new at a charity gala. He, 45M, was a successful businessman who seemed nice enough at first, polite, well-spoken, and apparently very successful in the financial sector. They got married within a year of dating, which seemed a bit rushed to me, but I kept my concerns to myself. That's when things started to change, slowly but surely. The changes were subtle at first, almost imperceptible. Our son would come home with expensive new gadgets, the latest iPhone, gaming consoles, designer clothes. When I asked about them, he'd say his stepdad bought them for him. I wasn't thrilled, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. I told myself it was natural for a new stepdad to want to make a good impression. Then came the extravagant trips during his mom's weeks, Disney World, skiing in Switzerland, private yacht vacations. The kind of stuff I could never afford on my teacher's salary. Each time he'd return, his stories would be less about the experiences and more about the money spent. The first-class flights, the presidential suites, the expensive restaurants. I started noticing concerning changes in my son's behavior. He became more withdrawn during his weeks with me, spending most of his time in his room playing with his new toys or texting his friends about his next big trip. Our weekly pizza and movie nights, which had been our tradition since he was little, were now boring. When I suggested we go camping like we used to, he'd say camping was boring or for poor people. That last comment felt like a knife to the heart. This wasn't the kid I'd raised. The situation got worse during holidays and special occasions. His stepdad would deliberately schedule elaborate celebrations that overlapped with my designated time, putting our son in the position of having to choose between a lavish party and a simple dinner with dad. More often than not, he chose the party. I'd get texts with pictures of him at these events, looking happy but somehow different, more focused on showing off his expensive clothes than actually enjoying himself. I tried talking to my ex about it multiple times. The first few conversations were civil but unproductive. "He's just making sure, son. Feels welcome in his new family," she'd say. "You're just jealous because you can't provide these things." As time went on, these discussions became more heated. She accused me of trying to sabotage her new marriage out of spite. Her husband would occasionally join these conversations, always maintaining a calm, condescending demeanor that made me feel like I was being unreasonable. The real truth started coming out about 8 months ago. It was a Wednesday evening, not my week with my son, when he showed up at my door absolutely distraught. His eyes were red from crying, and he could barely get the words out. Through tears, he revealed that his stepdad had been manipulating him for years. Apparently, he'd been telling my son things like, "Your dad could afford nice things too if he really cared about you, and maybe if you spend more time here, I'll buy you that car you want when you turn 16. He'd even suggested that my son should consider living with them full-time, promising to pay for any college he wanted to attend if he did. But what really broke my son was discovering that his stepdad had been lying about his business all along. That morning, the FBI had raided their house. It turned out he'd been running an elaborate Ponzi scheme, defrauding investors of millions. The expensive gifts, the lavish trips, all of it had been paid for with stolen money. My ex had no idea. She was just as shocked as everyone else. She believed in his successful business just like everyone else had. The next few months were absolute chaos. My ex-wife moved in with her sister, completely humiliated and broken. Her husband was facing serious federal charges, and their assets were frozen. The media was having a field day with the story, and some of my son's schoolmates had started making comments about his stepdad being a criminal. Through all this, my son struggled with intense guilt, feeling like he'd betrayed me by falling for his stepdad's manipulation. Our son moved in with me full-time during this period. The first few weeks were rough. He was angry, confused, and ashamed. He'd alternate between long periods of silence and emotional outbursts. One night, he broke down and confessed that he'd started to believe his stepdad's implications that I didn't love him enough because I couldn't buy him expensive things. The pain in his voice when he admitted this broke my heart, but I was grateful for his honesty. Then, 3 weeks ago, something unexpected happened. My ex's husband was found dead in his cell, apparent suicide. He left a letter addressed to my son, confessing everything. He admitted to deliberately trying to drive a wedge between us because he was jealous of our close relationship. He wrote about how watching us together reminded him of his own failed relationship with his father, and how he'd convinced himself that he could buy the love he never had. The letter was manipulative even in death, full of self-pity and excuses, but at least it provided some answers. The funeral was yesterday. My son asked me to go with him. He said he needed closure. As we stood there, watching the small gathering of family members, most of his business associates and friends had abandoned him after the scandal. My son turned to me and said something I'll never forget. "Dad, I'm sorry I ever thought money could replace what we have." We both ended up crying right there in the cemetery. This whole experience has been surreal. My son is in therapy now, working through his feelings of guilt and manipulation. The therapist says it's common for kids his age to be susceptible to this kind of material manipulation, but that doesn't make it any easier to watch him struggle with these feelings. My ex-wife and I are actually closer than we've been in years, united in our concern for our son's well-being. She's in therapy too, coming to terms with how she was deceived by someone she trusted. We're slowly rebuilding our family dynamics. My ex has moved into a modest apartment nearby, and we've returned to our original custody arrangement, though our son often asks to spend extra time at my place. The expensive gadgets and designer clothes have been replaced with more modest alternatives. At first, I worried this would be a difficult adjustment for him, but he seems almost relieved to be free of the pressure to maintain that lifestyle. I'm sharing this because I want other parents to know that money and fancy gifts can't replace genuine love and connection with your kids. My son learned this the hard way, but he's also learned that it's okay to make mistakes as long as you learn from them. He's showing remarkable resilience and maturity in processing everything that's happened. Looking back, I wish I'd been more proactive when I first noticed the changes in my son's behavior. But I was afraid of seeming like the bitter ex who couldn't compete with the new, wealthy stepdad. I've learned that being a good parent isn't about competing. It's about being consistent, honest, and present, even when it feels like you're losing the battle. The most painful part of all this is watching my son grapple with the reality that someone he trusted had been manipulating him all along. But I'm also proud of how he's handling it. Last weekend, we went camping, his idea this time. As we sat by the campfire, making s'mores and talking about everything and nothing, he looked more like his old self than he had in years. I know we still have a long road ahead of us. Trust takes time to rebuild, and there will be difficult conversations and moments of doubt. But for the first time in years, I feel like I truly have my son back. And no amount of money could ever buy that feeling. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with friends or family who might enjoy it too. Your support means a lot. And if you have any thoughts, questions, or story ideas, drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next story.